on behalf of the Labour Party.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Damien O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, Labor supports this bill. It seems on the face of it to be a very sensible piece of legislation, Mr Speaker, at a time when there's urgent action needed by both the government and by councils. And Labor's had some input into it, and acknowledged the Minister there, and one of them being quite an important adjustment which says that all things should be reasonable. We're not asking for absolute powers here. Everything should be judged against a reasonable proposition put forward. And I hold up this paper here, one of the farming papers, a shocker. And I guess that summarises, what the rural sector thinks of what has happened here. I go back to the 80s, Mr Speaker, to just remind people what Kaikoura was back then. And many people had written it off, really. A few farms. But through the amazing efforts of, I have to acknowledge, Wally Stone, his determination, his appreciation of what Kaikoura had was that it had amazing wildlife, and in particular had a few whales that were spouting off the coastline. That was turned into, with the help of Ngāi Tahu and their commitment, an amazing venture that brought that town to life, and unfortunately now has, with nature again, has once again brought it to its knees. And I think we have an obligation in Parliament to do everything to help them get back on their feet and up and running. It won't be an easy job. The provisions in this piece of legislation are sensible. They just mean that if work has to be done, reasonable work, to either help farmers in particular to get water back to their stock, open up their laneways to allow stock to move from one paddock to another, just to get them up and be able to milk their cows again, then that should take place. If it would have required a resource consent, then they can apply for that retrospectively, and I'm sure the councils will deal with that very, very sensibly. So it's not much to argue about, Mr Speaker, but I will say, and I went and I visited Waiau last Friday before. I have to acknowledge Hamish Dobby, who was there as the Chief Executive. He fronted a meeting, the first meeting, public meeting of that community. And I have to say, a message for the government, they were very wary. Many of those people were refugees from Christchurch. They'd gone up to Waiau to seek refuge, to get a safer place. They didn't have a lot of money, and they were being told by officials that all would be good. We'd look after all your insurance claims. Well, I have to say, those local people were very, very cynical. And it will be up to EQC and the other government agencies to treat those people with more respect, perhaps, than they've had in Christchurch, and to deliver on the ground in a more timely way than has happened. And I'm sure that everyone will be learning from that. Mr Speaker, I have to say that there are some things we should learn from this. The legislation can't legislate for it. But we, are helping things to get back on I guess, on the way forward. Resilience is a very trendy word at the moment, but it's actually a very true one too. What the government has done is, of course, squeeze funding for roading through the whole of the South Island. And I drove through the Lewis Pass 4 days after the earthquake, Mr Speaker. There were huge potholes appearing. The road was being hammered. And there will be requirements, I'm sure, and I acknowledge this legislation does allow for resource consents outside the two core areas, and I think there'll be urgent work required on the Lewis Pass Road and the other roads around Murchison to ensure that they remain safe. Because if we end up with huge potholes without work being done to fix them, they become unsafe very, very quickly. And so the bill does allow for that. As I understand it, that not just the Hurunui District Council, Mr Speaker, and the two Kaikoura District Council, they're not the only two that have relief through this legislation, and I know the government will have to do that. Mr Speaker, I'm not going to say any more because we do want to change, pass it through. Just a couple of other reminders, though. I think Fonterra might be regretting the decision to close the factory there at Kaikoura. I think for them the message is resilience again. Having huge, big super sites may not always be the best solution in a country that is very kind of young and is very seismic. And we need to keep at the back of our minds that these events will happen, that we always need a plan B. This legislation allows Kaikoura and North Canterbury to get up on their feet again, and Labor supports it.